Welcome back everyone to the 5th episode in the Minecraft Ideas Academy series. Each video will cover a different aspect of game design that is specific to suggestions and vanilla style mods. Today I'm joined by Kingbdogz, a developer at Mojang Studios. And Kingbdogz, at the moment you're a mid-game designer, is that correct?
That is correct. Technically, gameplay developer, that's our actual technical role. But even within the company, we talked about the role term gameplay developer doesn't really make sense because we're designers, but we also do a little bit of programming, actually quite a lot of programming. So we're kind of a hybrid role of game designer and engineer at the same time. And it's entirely possible that our role name will change at some point, but it's just names, it's just semantics. It doesn't really matter. But at the core, I'm a game designer.
Yeah. I guess for a game as complex as Minecraft, you probably need to know a decent amount of code to make sure whether your ideas will actually work.
Yeah, it's a bit of that, and I think something that people maybe don't entirely understand is that even though Minecraft is a very old game, like it's been around for like at least 11 years now, it doesn't have a whole lot of tooling. So let's say just adding a new block to the game, that still as of right now requires programming. There's not like a tool where you just go, oh, I just want to add a new block. So because of that, we kind of like it necessitates some ability of programming and engineering, and that's not just on one code base like Java Edition. That's also on Bedrock Edition as well. So yeah, there's complexities in the engine itself, and then on top of that, there's not like an easy way to add content in the way that you might expect.
Yeah, fair enough. And of course, a lot of people will know you from your background as a modder, especially for the Aether mod. So, with all that, do you kind of feel like there's a certain responsibility on you? How there's always people will be like, "Oh, cool, they hired the guy who made the Aether mod. Now he can put the Aether into Minecraft." Like, do you kind of feel like you have a reputation of sorts to live up to?
So when I first joined, I feel like there definitely were expectations like that from the community. And I think I even remember watching like before I even properly joined or actually got into the studio, there was a video from IBX Toycat who was like, "Oh my god, the guy who made the Aether is joining Mojang," and I kind of had to clarify to the community that just because I have had some prior experience in making a mod, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to be implementing that mod into the game. And I have thought about this a little bit in terms of like, not just the organization aspect that, they can't just take a mod and just add it to the game, but there's also the personal side for me as a modder. I always look at it this way, that mods already exist. The Aether mod currently exists. You can play it on at least some versions of Minecraft. There's also the Aether 2 and everything. And then there's vanilla Minecraft, and both of those can still exist at the same time, and you don't necessarily need to have it in vanilla to enjoy those experiences. The Aether mod's not going anywhere. It's right there. You can install it right now on your version of Minecraft, right? And I think like that's okay. It doesn't not everything that is a great idea needs to be in vanilla Minecraft. And for me personally, working on vanilla Minecraft now, I would much rather have the opportunity to, do something entirely different. If we were to add a new dimension at some point, I would want it to be different than the Aether, because then otherwise we're just doing the same thing again, and you're not really, as a player, you're not really getting anything new. You're just getting something that already exists, but now it's just in vanilla Minecraft.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've kind of had a decent amount of trouble trying to think about what a fourth dimension would even be like. Like, either with its floating islands and with also floating islands. Like the theming is very different, but like the core structure of like what makes things an environment versus like justifying a whole dimension. I feel like you really need to say this literally cannot fit in any other dimension. And I'm wondering if there's anything that would even not that would be like not able to fit into any of the existing dimensions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because, I mean, first of all, like the end dimension that we have at the moment, it's not very fleshed out for me at least. I definitely think that it has room for improvement. And I think when you think about adding a new dimension, or even just not even just adding a new dimension, but rather thinking about what is the purpose of dimensions in Minecraft, I think you kind of need to come at it from the context of like what do the current dimensions provide? Like what makes the overworld different from the Nether? What makes the Nether different from the End? And of course there are like niches to it, right? Like there's the different types of terrain generation. You've got the Nether and it's kind of cavernous, you know, you don't have a sky. You got the End, which is floating islands, but you know, it doesn't have, in my opinion, enough niches yet to really clarify its true difference from other dimensions because it's just not filled out enough. Um, and adding a new dimension, if we ever did that, I think we need to really think about what is the purpose of a dimension. Like why would we add a dimension versus just adding new areas to the overworld that look really really different or behave really really different or the gameplay is really different. And I think like my just random gut feeling now, it's not something that like we've like done work on or that I know, but I feel like it would have to be justified through something that is kind of global in that like experience. Like even just something as an example in the Nether, you know, you can't place water in the Nether except for things like cauldrons, but you know, you can't place water in the Nether, and that is a global kind of change to that sandbox experience you have in Minecraft. And I think a new dimension would need to utilize that sort of mechanic or utilize those sort of mechanics in order to justify its existence. I want to expand really quickly because I feel like I've answered the question, but there's something else. I think, you know, if we think of Minecraft as a game that we want to last for the next 50 years, something that I've been thinking of is like, how do we partition all of that content? Um, if we just keep adding more and more to the overworld, will it get to a point where the overworld just kind of feels like almost too overbearing? Like there's too much content and almost like it would be too difficult to discover all that content because you have to go out really far and there's, you know, there's a lot of challenges on the way to get to what you want to discover. Maybe dimensions could be one of those like design tools to easily partition content into sort of like sections. If you think of it like a traditional linear video game, like it would be like different levels, right? So just yeah, thinking of Minecraft for 50 years, maybe that's one of the tools we could use to make it easier for people to kind of like section their experiences. I don't know. It's just random thought that I've been thinking about.
No, that is a really interesting thought. Yeah, although I guess you aren't against adding new environments to the overworld. Like with the Deep Dark, a lot of people are like, oh, you know, maybe the Deep Dark's related to the End and stuff. And it's like, well, you know, it can be in its own thing. You know, the overworld can have a little bit of fantasy as a treat.
Yeah, you know, I really love the fantasy aspect to the overworld. Like one of my favorite additions in you know Minecraft's history is probably the Mushroom Islands. Even though they don't really have, you know, they don't have that much content to them. I feel like, you know, the mushrooms themselves, like they're cool, and the brown mushrooms are really cool as well. But like when you go there, it's just kind of like, okay, I found a really cool like fantasy island, but there's not much to do there. But I'd like us to explore more of that, and that's kind of why, you know, that's why I'm pretty happy with the fact that the Sniffer won the mob vote because um, I just feel like it's inherently a fantasy mob, right? And it gets to kind of expand that side of Minecraft where, you know, it appears on the surface like this maybe generic, like medieval-esque game, survival game, but then you dig a little bit deeper and it's like, oh wow, there's actually quite some interesting fantasy elements to it that aren't generic stuff. Like I feel like skeletons and zombies, those sort of mobs, they're pretty generic fantasy elements, but then I like the aspect of, you know, going to the deep dark and there's something really unique, something that you haven't seen in other games before, or um, even the
Strider?
uh, yeah, the mushrooms, yeah, striders as well. Although, to be fair with the striders, I feel like, you know, as soon as you go into the Nether, it's, I mean, I guess there's hellscapes in many games that are that's a generic fantasy element enough, but it is different. It's definitely different to, I would say, other characters you would find in that sort of environment.
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like Minecraft is kind of building up its own creative identity in that way, whereas the old things based on kind of generic monsters, and then you're getting all this new stuff, and it feels like Minecraft is becoming its own kind of story in that regard, and you can't just say, oh, this is from here, this is from here. So the things that you've spearheaded are Striders, Warden, and I think Crying Obsidian and Raw Ores. What else have you worked on since joining Mojang?
I mean, there's a lot. The thing is that there's definitely like individual features I can point to, but I think as a game designer, there are so many little tiny things throughout the years that you're kind of being a part of. I mean, I'll just give an example. Like on Fridays, generally in the morning, there's something called Java triage. There's also Bedrock triage as well, and this is basically a meeting where we, for half an hour, go through all the latest bugs that have come in through Jira, and we assign a priority to them. And engineers are there, but also designers are there, and kind of the perspective that a designer brings is not only, okay, this is really important to fix, or this is not important to fix, whatever. The other thing is like, sometimes we'll find, I don't know, a parity bug of like, oh, this feature works this way on Bedrock, and and it also works in this way in Java. And the perspective we have to bring is like, okay, which there's obviously history to why it works one way or the other on the different editions, but like, what do we actually want for Minecraft going forward? And sometimes that can be really tricky because, uh, you have to first of all dig up the history of like, okay, how did it get introduced into the game in general? You need to find the intent, either talking to team members who are still around, like Jens, or you have to go through the change logs and figure out, okay, this is what they intended. Um, and through that you kind of have to figure out, okay, this is what it's meant to be, or we bring it to the design team, or the design craft in general, and just say, okay, we don't know why it was this way, or even if not, even if we don't know why it was this way, if we know that it is this way because of reasons, what do we want for the future of Minecraft? And so there's a lot of that stuff where it's like small things, small bugs that come in where you kind of have to almost reverse engineer Minecraft's game design, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess one of the recent, relatively recent changes we can consider is the monsters spawning in complete darkness. Like there might have been a decent reason that they had that number 7 there. Well, maybe not a decent reason, but at least a reason where they might say, they still want a certain amount of mobs to spawn. Back when Minecraft was more of a survival based game with a lot more heavy survival elements, and they'd be like, yeah, we want it to be at light level 7. Whereas as Minecraft's kind of gotten more towards its sandbox style of gameplay, they're like, no, actually, we want it so that players can control the spawning of monsters, and that way you kind of added that lighting change in there as a much clearer way of how to prevent monsters from spawning.
Yeah, and the context for the game changes over time, right? Like, compare Minecraft when it was first released, or the first couple updates. Um, if you think of caves and cliffs, we suddenly introduced so much more surface area to the game. Now, of course, the surface did change too, but it didn't change in similar dramatic ways. Where, for example, there's kind of, if you go into a cave in caves and cliffs, you've got these big caverns that just on the sides, you're not just torching up the surface area in front of you. You've got these sides which have like jagged edges where mobs can spawn. And you got to keep that in mind as you're designing Minecraft going forward, that, it's not exactly the same game it used to be. And sometimes these parameters, such as, light level spawning, they have to be adjusted to deliver the same experience you had back when you first played it. And that's something we talked about a lot when making that change of like, first of all, what is the justification for changing it? But then also on top of that, like, what was the experience that Minecraft was trying to deliver when it first got released? And are we delivering that same experience now, given the changes that have been made to world generation? the things that I've worked on are, I've of course the first mob that I ever worked on was the Strider, and that was an interesting experience because everyone in the studio, or at least in the vanilla team, was like, "We don't want to touch this mob. It looks ugly. We don't feel it looks vanilla." We were kind of hesitant in the team of like, do we really want something like this in the game? Does it feel like it visually fits? And I kind of took that on as a challenge of like, okay, let's see what we can do. First of all, I wanted to see, could we make it cute, even though a lot of people thought it was ugly. And I also wanted to find a way to make it feel, very vanilla, in its behaviors and its mechanics. Then I also worked on Soul Speed, which has been a really interesting thing for me to look back on, because when we first snapshotted it, over time there were a lot of pieces of feedback that came in. Basically, with Soul Speed, it will damage the durability of your boots over time. The more you walk on soul sand or soul soil. And that was seen from the community as like something that, no way, this enchantment is going to be completely useless. No one's going to use it, because like, why would you use this thing when it's going to break your armor over time? And it was really interesting, like looking after that update was released, that pretty much everyone uses it, and it doesn't seem to be a problem whatsoever. Um, and I don't know why that is. I mean, of course, we can look to things like mending, um, which is interesting that the community has this perspective that, oh, it's going to break my boots, but then also at the same time everyone uses mending anyway, so why are they even complaining? But I think it's just interesting to figure out when to listen to the community, and like when it's not saying that their gut feeling is wrong. It's more that sometimes we can't get that kind of long term gameplay cycle in order to figure out whether or not something's going to work. And that's actually something I was quite worried on with the other feature that I worked on, of course, is like the Deep Dark and the Ancient Cities and the Warden in particular. The Warden is something that I feel like, as much as we got a lot of feedback through snapshots, it's really not something you can just test in this like micro environment, like through a snapshot test. I feel like to really know whether or not it works, you need like hours and hours and hours of survival gameplay. Like, it needs to be a part of the world, and you need to get that feeling of how it integrates with the rest of the game. And that was something I was really worried about the Warden, actually, of like, will it successfully integrate with the rest of the world? Will it feel like it's too much of this like curated experience for the specific area, and it doesn't feel like it connects to anything? And I don't know. Yeah, I still don't know. I think it's interesting. I mean, even to hear your thoughts of what you think. Like, how does it integrate with the rest of the world? Does it feel natural?
Well, I think it's quite clever of how you managed to take all these kind of old, forgotten, well, maybe not forgotten, but like less useful stuff, and just kind of roll them into the Warden's gameplay. Like wool, for example. Wool previously virtually just a aesthetic block unless you want to make some beds, and then that like. And sneaking as well. I mean, sneaking has its uses, but it brings on a whole new context here. So, like, two features, they make up a significant part of the gameplay. There was another one that I was thinking of potentially, but yeah, it's interesting how you've. It's same with XP, right? Sculk gives you a lot of XP, and that could be a possible alternative for someone who doesn't want to make a mob grinder or whatever. They can go to Deep Dark and get out their hoe. I think you don't even need an iron hoe to insta mine, so you can literally just like
Yeah,
mow through it. It is so satisfying.
yeah. Yeah, and I guess like that there are arguments for it connecting very well with like old mechanics like redstone. I shouldn't call it old mechanic. It's like, oh, it's this old mechanic that no one uses. No, it's not that. But I think I do remember when designing the Deep Dark that I wanted it to, and I don't know if it's successful again, but I wanted it to appeal to pretty much every player archetype within the game, at least some small amount. And I think some things came kind of by accident. Like the Sculk block existed it as a whole feature because I was working on the Warden. And I was like, what if this like sound listening mechanic would be applied to a block instead of a mob. And I don't think anyone in the team actually wanted me to do it because it would be quite difficult, like code wise. But I gave it a shot and I was like, oh, this is really cool. Like, okay, what if it emits a redstone signal whenever it like detects a sound? And then I was just kind of thinking of all the possibilities through that. So like, there's a lot of features within the Deep Dark package that kind of came by accident, but then there were other things that I felt were quite intentional. Like I wanted sneaking to be a mechanic now. Like I wanted it to be more than just a multiplayer thing where you can't hear the sounds. Um, and great examples, of course, with Wool as well. I feel like Wool was intentional, but like it was more that I wanted the ability to prevent sounds from being detected. And I just thought of, okay, what's the most natural block that could do this? And it was like, oh, of course, it's Wool. Like, what other block could it be? Um, and just kind of through that, thought process, you kind of you pull in things from the game that like past features of the game that feel natural, and I think as a result, hopefully that makes it integrate well into the whole experience.
Yeah, thematically at least. It's the same with the Redstone, because Redstone always kind of felt like it didn't really, like it was this whole other system. And of course, it was useful for a lot of stuff, but it didn't really feel like it integrated well with the quasi lore of the world.
Hmm.
And now Sculk like has a very specific, like intentional relationship with Redstone. You don't need an observer to get the Sculk sensors to give out Redstone. They're somehow connected. Before, I think the only other like non-electronic kind of uses for Redstone would have been potions. I think making them longer.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, that was actually something that I thought about during the development process of Caves and Cliffs. That there was some ideas that I had spinning in my head of like, how do we make redstone at the very least the material, not necessarily the mechanics, but how do you make the redstone material an attractive reward for players? Like, if you think of players who never mess around with redstone and just do not care about it, as soon as they see a patch of redstone, they're either disappointed or just like completely ignore it, like it doesn't exist whatsoever. And I think that's really interesting because as a game, that is all about mining, you'd think for survival players that don't use redstone mechanics, we'd have some use for them that gives them, the interest of mining this resource. And of course, you mentioned things like increasing potion length, but I feel like that's not enough. And yeah, I just remember thinking about like it'd be interesting if like, oh, I don't know, what if there was like a weapon that used redstone as like a uh as a basically an ammo counter or something. Like that's the resource you use to like shoot a projectile. I don't know. It could be anything, but just something that gives survival players more reason to mine that resource.
Yeah, yeah, it would be cool to have that sort of stuff because even though it does have a lot of uses in one area of the game, it has significantly less in many of the others.
Yeah.
This is a kind of a random question, but when I mentioned that I was going to do a podcast with you, someone asked me to ask you why Lodestones have netherite in their crafting recipe. Like, why are they so expensive? Can you speak on that?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I think I can start off with I think that lodestones are placed in the completely wrong progression, or the completely wrong part of the progression of the game. Um, it's not that lodestones aren't useful, even once you get them, with netherite. I think it's more that players would potentially be able to use them or utilize them better earlier within the game and probably with a less expensive recipe. Because netherite, you can get a lot of it, but I don't think that it is. I don't think it's quite the correct material that we should have used for that block. And that there are similar examples of this. Like, there's been a lot of talk during the Wild update of like, this is from the community in particular, is the recovery compass the right place to get that mechanic. Um, and I think this is where there is like a tension between the gameplay mechanics and the progression and the thematics of the area that is currently, being developed, or even as you're playing it, like what makes sense as a player. So like for me, the recovery compass, what I like about the fact, like, that reward for the Deep Dark and the Warden is that this whole place is so hostile and it's so possible for you to die at every point in time. And I like this idea of the player almost going through these horrific challenges and overcoming them, and the reward they get is like some small ability to overcome the challenges of death, which is again recovering your items in a much easier way. So that's like the thematics of it. But then on the gameplay side of like, okay, when would players actually use this? I think players probably struggle the most to find their items when they're new and when they haven't explored much of the overworld yet. And so that's it's just an interesting problem. I'm not saying necessarily that like that means we should change where the recovery compass is accessed in the progression, but I think it's an interesting problem to think about and something that we have to be conscious of as much as possible. I still think it's probably the right place to get it thematically, but maybe there's a different way that you could overcome parts of death that doesn't necessarily rely on recovering your items or finding where your items are. And going back to the lodestone, uh, yeah, I think in the development process and the design process, the idea was that we wanted rewards for bastions, and we wanted reward like new fancy toys to play with when you went to the Nether. And I think again, this is sort of what I was talking about, like this tension between thematics and progression. But in this case, it's not thematics. I think it's just the update itself. Like there's the update, and there's the progression. And I think when we're designing like a big thematic update like that, we're kind of honing in our whole vision into that section of the game, and it can be difficult sometimes to like take a step back and look at this like broad perspective of the whole game. And I think that's where, in my opinion, and not every designer in the team will agree with me, I think that we probably need to take a look at the lodestone again and just figure out, you know where does it fit better in the game.
Yeah, I think that's one of the advantages of 120 as well. Like in previous updates, they were themed. It's like, oh, we could add this, but then we have to try and make it fit with the theme. Whereas now there's much. Well, there's still a theme, but it's a lot broader and a lot more miscellaneous, kind of, maybe. So yeah, it seems like it'd be easy to kind of address problems from all over in all aspects of the game instead of having to go, oh well, we can't add a new water thing until we do update aquatic version 2 or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the advantage that we have with 120 is that even though we have internal themes that we're following, the fact that they're not very well defined or understood by the community itself, it allows us to be flexible in a lot of ways. If you think of the Caves and Cliffs update, if we spent our time on anything that didn't relate to either cliffs or caves, the community would not be happy with that feature most likely, because they would feel like, oh, that could have been a cave biome instead, or oh, that could have been a new mob in the game that relates to caves. So I think for me so far, that has been definitely the biggest advantage, that we're able to, first of all, again, like, go back and focus on these things that have kind of been um, sore spots in the game for a while. But also, if we feel like the community is saying, hey, this part of the game really needs to be improved, even though we have our own internal themes of like, this is what we want the update to be, we can just change them to fit what the community wants, without them getting upset that like it's kind of a broken promise or something, like, oh, you said you were going to focus on this, but then you did this. So it's just interesting. I don't know what is the better way to do updates, whether it's like, previously like 119, 118, uh, or if it's, or 120 is a better way. But I just think it's different, and I think it's definitely exciting, some of the stuff that we've been doing. Like, I'm really happy with chisel bookshelves. I think that's something that, like, it's really interesting that a lot of the features in 120 so far that you've seen, is like, why wasn't this in the game to begin with? And I like that feeling. I like that feeling of adding things that probably should have always been in the game, but we didn't have time to focus on it. Same with the creative inventory, like that. That creative inventory was an absolute mess in the current version that is released in Minecraft. So yeah, I'm happy to be able to go back and focus on those sort of features.
Yeah, and I think it's good that it's taking that turn because I think the more themed updates worked when Minecraft just kind of felt empty as a game. And then you'd be like, oh, let's revamp the oceans, let's revamp the nether, let's revamp villages, let's revamp the whole overworld and underground and stuff, and that sort of thing. And now I think we're getting to the point where, like, there's a decent amount of content. Now we can try and like look at the smaller bits and see how we can kind of bring them up to be on the same quality, on par with the new content. Also, going back to what we talk about, recovery compasses. Yeah, I feel like it still kind of works because especially if you're not like a combat oriented player, like I kind of find the deep dark easier than just caves in general because like in a cave you're gonna have like a million monsters coming at you, and it's not always possible to avoid them all, and you have to tank a lot of hits. Whereas Warden, there's like one enemy, like maybe two Wardens if they're around, but they still don't know exactly where you are, and you have a lot more time to kind of make sure that you avoid both of them. Like it might be incredibly stressful, especially because the consequences can be disastrous. But like you have a lot more time to think. It's a lot more like a puzzle encounter than a combat encounter. And like personally, like my playstyle, I prefer that to combat. So difficulty doesn't really make sense. Like it might be difficult to get the recovery come ups, but it's difficult in a different way.
I think it's I'm really glad that you mentioned puzzle because I definitely feel like that is the vibe that we were going for the Deep Dark. And what I like about that whole experience is that once you understand the mechanics, it is easy. But when you're first presented with it, and let's say you haven't watched, Minecraft Live and you haven't followed Kingbdogz tweets or whatever, right? Like you don't know what is going on. And you might not even know that sneaking is something that actually prevents detections. These are things that you slowly uncover throughout the game, and again through advancements like Sneak 100. So it's cool to have an experience in the game that once you overcome it and once you understand it, and as long as you like take your time, you pace yourself, that it is an easy experience, or at least it's not a, I wouldn't say it's not a challenging experience. It's more just that you have all the tools necessary to overcome it, and that's what makes it feel easy once you're experienced. And that's good. That's the sort of stuff that you want in a survival game. Like you want it to be this kind of curve that it's like really really difficult, and then suddenly I get it, and then you can kind of work within that space. I think another thing with the recovery compass is that there is again this problem that people use F3 a lot, and it's not just in Java and in Bedrock. There's a toggle that shows your coordinates, and I think that makes it so for some people the recovery compass feels useless. And I think that's just kind of, a bit of a design flaw, or not even a design flaw, because like within Java Edition, F3 is just a debug menu. You're not meant to use it for gameplay, but people use it anyway. And I think we're trying to find ways in the design to expose these values in the gameplay itself without having to rely on the F3 menu. And, maybe eventually it's entirely possible that we don't want to show players their coordinates unless like you're specifically I don't know, you enable some sort of option in the menu that says like show coordinates or something. But there's always going to be that problem because everyone's going to click on show coordinates. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's really interesting that we have this like debug aspect of the game that is so integral to like 30% of the players in the player base, and I don't really know what to do about that as a designer.
Yeah, something else about the recovery compasses. I feel like it would have been better received if people hadn't kind of treated it as the only tool to like recover after death, like say if your items didn't despawn, then like the recovery compass
Mhm.
would probably have been seen as like a kind of more quality of life thing instead of a, oh thank goodness now I can find my items before they despawn. Like if they didn't despawn, if they took much longer to despawn, then if it's just
Mhm.
kind of more of a nice to have thing, then people probably wouldn't have gone, oh no, now I have to go through this scary, terrifying difficult experience so that I can save myself from the things that would have killed me before. Whereas if it's just a quality of life thing, maybe not quality of life, but just kind of makes the process easier, then I feel like maybe paired with that feature, it might have been more positive. But that's just hypothetical.
Yeah, like it was something that I thought about during the development process of the Deep Dark and its rewards. That yeah, that was that was an idea on the table of like, what if there was an item that prevented your items from despawning on death? And I think the conclusion that I came to is that first of all, the despawning mechanic is like severely broken. It is not clear to the player when despawning starts, like the timer, because if a chunk is not loaded, then it won't, tick that timer. Um, so it's not like it's 5 minutes and then it despawns, because if it's really far away, that timer starts when you're actually like in the view distance of wherever your items are. Um, so that was one problem, but then like you even think of, okay, so let's say you made it so it always ticks, right? It always ticks the timer down even if the chunk isn't loaded. Then well, that's even worse, because players can have their items literally 100 chunks away or 200 chunks away, and how do you expect them to actually get back to their location where they died and recover their items? It's just not possible. So my point is that, like, first of all, the despawning mechanic is like really broken with its timer, and it doesn't really make sense, I would say, to most players. Like, players shouldn't understand the concept of chunks unless you're like a really heavy tech player and you like kind of exposing the underlying data structures of the game. A player shouldn't like literally be exposed to these like engine concepts, right? Um, and it just kind of made me think, okay, if we add an item that prevents despawning, are we just trying to fix a broken mechanic through progression? Or should we actually just fix the broken mechanic somehow? Like, should we revisit that mechanic? Like, what gameplay does it provide to the experience of playing Minecraft? So, in a roundabout way, I'm saying like I wasn't really sure what was the right approach there, and I think in general it was better to not do that item and take a look at despawning in general in the future, and think about what is best for Minecraft. With the recovery compass, it was a bit different, because I feel like where you're uh, finding where your items are, I think that is like a really good aspect of the like survival experience of Minecraft. And I also think that we wouldn't want to have a HUD or something, or an overlay whenever you died that just pointed you to where you were. I think that is something that can be attached to progression rather than something that's just inherently part of the game. Um, so yeah, I hope that all makes sense. It's something that I'm still thinking about to this day, of like what is despawning items in Minecraft actually trying to do? Like what experience does it provide?
Yeah, that makes sense because, like, yeah, if you have a mechanic that's broken from the start, you don't want to fix it and say it's almost like a band aid. If you give someone an item, it's like, yeah, sure, this bad thing will happen by default, but you can fix it by getting one of these. I think a similar thing was raised with the glare, like the fact that the glare would specifically point you towards dark areas seemed to like cement the idea that monster spawning was always tied to lightning. Like there's some people who still think mobs only spawning complete darkness isn't far enough, and that there should be ways for them to use complete darkness in their builds without having to risk any mobs. Like even if they could light up their stuff and use far less torches and be able to like hide all their lighting really tastefully and everything, there'd still be that small problem. So yeah, I understand like not wanting to kind of fix a broken mechanic with an item instead of just redo the mechanic.
Yeah, another good example for me would be like keep inventory. I think there are, of course, a lot of mods that introduce like at least partial keep inventory. And my question is always like, are we saying that the game is better when you keep aspects of your inventory when you die? And if so, why is that applied through an item versus just having that part of the game to begin with? Is it fun to go through the progression of making that easier over time? And if so, why do we want the late game of Minecraft to feel easier rather than still challenging? It's just, yeah, it's a very complicated topic, I think. Like, what deserves to be in progression and what deserves to be inherent to the game.
Yeah, and I think it's really reassuring that you peeps at Mojang are thinking about this, because there can all be all sorts of mods that say, "Hey, look, we did this cool thing. We solved this issue. We have this thing that will really improve your gameplay." But to go deeper than that and say, "But why is this like this in the first place?" and like thinking of the much bigger issues that it exposes, that helps for a much longer term plan for the future.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I could throw so many examples at you, but like for me, another one is a hunger
Oh
system.
yes.
I think it's inherently horrible and broken and needs to be torn apart. And it's not because survival, like it's not because I think that survival as like a theme for Minecraft shouldn't be in Minecraft. It's more that I actually think our system doesn't really provide a really good sense of survival in the late game, because you're no longer eating food to survive. You're eating food to like just do basic functions like be able to sprint. There's just, yeah, there's really interesting like underlying systems within the game that I think really break apart as soon as you get into like the late game of what players actually do in Minecraft. And then the question at that point is like, okay, there's two solutions. There's we make it so in some way hunger literally doesn't matter anymore in the late game, which kind of just makes you think, what's the point of the hunger system to begin with? Because is it only for the early game? Which could be valid. We could say, okay, only the early game, this is something you have to worry about. In the late game, you never have to worry about it again. But I get kind of nervous about that. It's like, okay, then why do we have this mechanic? What's the point? What's the purpose? Um, I think I had a second point, but I forgot.
Yeah, it might be similar to the whole people wanting some sort of boot enchantment to avoid the warden. Like, if you have that, then you've just kind of gotten rid of an area of the game. So like, either if it's bad and then you get rid of it later, then why have the bad thing in the first place? But if it's
Mm-hmm.
but if it's good and you get rid of it, then you've just gotten rid of a good thing. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to the warden, because this is what I was really curious about, but kind of got off track with with all the dev talk. Um,
Yeah, that's okay.
anyway, so I really wanted to break down exactly like how the warden was iterated. There was like what 170 iterations of the warden. Is that right?
Honestly, I can't remember how many iterations there was at this point. I think I think we had a lot more iterations on the art side than we did on the gameplay side. But I think on gameplay it was probably like 10 very very distinct versions that had like very different visions of what that creature could be, and then in between them there were like little tiny iterations that you know were different but didn't necessarily make like this huge splash of like, okay, this is a different mob basically. So yeah, it's really blurry and hard to remember everything at this point, but there was a lot. There was certainly a lot.
Yeah, I did some research from tweets you've posted in the past, and a couple of the Minecraft YouTube channels. Also, something you mentioned on the Spawn Chunks podcast when you had your thing there. So the Warden started from the blind piglin idea for the Nether update, right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's really interesting. I remember that at that time with the because this is something that I think people don't understand. A lot of people say that the Nether update was like a really big update, and they wish that we would do big updates like that again. The thing is, the Nether update, we intended it like at least in terms of the planned features we had of like, okay, at some point we're going to stop here, but this is all the cool ideas we have. It was like probably 6 or 8 times the size of what we actually released. We had so many ideas, and of course the struggle with figuring out um, what the update is going to be is like, okay, where do we stop? How much time do we have, and what is like really crucial to making this update really good? And that at that time, I remember, we were thinking a lot about what are the critical key features, and something we really wanted was the bastions. So some other features got pushed aside in order to make sure the bastions happened. Um, but I think it was, good for the update in the end. But going back to the blind piglin, I remember there was a concept of like basically if you dug down in the caverns of the Nether, there would be sort of sub biomes underneath that would have kind of a similar idea to the deep dark. It would be really dark. I think there were even ideas of like, okay, what if like torches actually gave like less light level, like it wasn't 15, maybe it would be like, I don't know, 5 or something. So like it would inherently be darker the lower down you got in the world of the Nether. And there could be piglins there that are kind of like sniffing around for gold. They're actually trying to dig up like gold ore, but they can't see. They rely on their scent rather than their vision because it's just so dark down there. And I think that was like that idea and probably many ideas before I even joined. I think Minecraft always wanted to do something with like, what if there was a blind mob? Like, how would that work? So I think that it all kind of started there, but then once we actually started Caves and Cliffs, it kind of made even more sense because caves in the overworld, like we wanted to add some variety to it. It wasn't just dark and horrible, but it also it could be things like the Lush Cave, which is really beautiful, but also we did want to go like even darker than what we originally had in Minecraft at the time. Um, and I remember there was a note in our gameplay summit. Just quick side note: a gameplay summit is when we all come together as a team and we just literally throw thousands of like sticky notes on the wall of like ideas, and then as a design team we go to all those ideas and kind of like whittle them down to something that feels like an update. But there was a note which was just like a blind mob that lives in the caves, and that was it. It was just that one note, and we kind of went from there. And then it was a really long journey until we got the Warden.
Nice. So I've heard that the first concept was the Shade and that it could rearrange its limbs. Do you remember much of that one?
Yeah, so actually that was the Stalker. So the Shade was actually it's not coming to the game anymore, at least not in the version that I designed it at the time. But the Shade is a completely different mob. It was trying to. So my idea at the time was either it was going to be a complementary mob to the Warden, or whatever the Warden became, or it was going to be basically just a different type of mob entirely. And this mob was going to be like a transparent humanoid creature, like humanoid-ish. It wouldn't be like Steve humanoid, but it would, I guess, like kind of you would argue sort of like the Enderman, how it's humanoid, but it's kind of elongated and it's different. It'd be kind of something like that. And the idea is that it would be transparent, kind of like a dark, transparent mob, and it would have glowing eyes, like really, really bright glowing eyes. And if you walk towards it, the closer you got, the more it would fade away. So as soon as you were within like, I don't know, 20 blocks of it, you wouldn't see it anymore. Like it would just completely be invisible. So if you were like in the caves, you would see like these glowing eyes just like looking at you, and then you walk towards it and it just vanishes. And the idea of the Shade was kind of adding sort of spooky ambience to the game and maybe even tying it in a little bit with the cave noises that you hear throughout the caves, which is, like what's the source of the cave noises? Um, I I wasn't necessarily going to say, of course, that the shades were what were causing it, but I was really playing on that idea in my head of like, okay, like here's some questions about Minecraft, like, oh, could it be this? What if it was this mob? Um, and a lot of mechanics from the Shade ended up being put into the Warden. So, for example, when I originally worked in the Shade, it was originally just a cow model. Um, and whenever you got close to it, the lights around you, like all the light sources, would start to flicker. So that's something that sort of came into the Warden later. It didn't flicker, but instead it kind of pulsated. We kind of found out early on that flickering is probably not a great idea for some players. It could cause like epilepsy potentially. So we didn't want to have anything that was too visually distracting or visually chaotic. But it did have the light source flickering, and it also had some pretty horrible stuff that I kind of wish we kind of introduced somewhere in the game. One example is if you were around shades and you couldn't see them when you're close up, you could hear certain sounds of mobs directly behind you. It would actually make sure to put the sound behind you. And one example was it could put the creeper like a hissing sound just as it was about to explode, and you would just like you would go throughout the caves and you wouldn't know that the shaders around you, and you would hear this hissing sound as if the creeper's about to explode behind you. You look around and it's not there, and it's like, oh my god, what? It was a bit too evil, probably, but I really love that idea. Like the shade was a really really cool concept, but it kind of steered away from what the mob was meant to be, which is a blind mob. It wasn't really a blind mob. It didn't have anything to do with listening. I was kind of just messing around and seeing like what can be creepy in Minecraft, and that the shade was the result of that. Like basically, it was very much focused on visual and auditory hallucinations.
Yeah. I'm not sure how well something like that would have aged as well, because I've heard a bit of criticism for stuff like cave noises being scary. It's like a comedian tickling and you saying, "See, you laughed." Like there's scary stuff happening, but there's kind of no context for it, so there's not really anything to be scared of. It's just all kind of confusing.
Yeah, I think something that could be interesting is like the sort of double red herring where like let's say a mob like this existed in the game and you started to get used to this idea of, oh, sometimes a creeper could hiss behind me but it's not actually there. The only thing that I could see that would be really interesting is like you hear a hissing sound behind you and you think, oh, it's probably a shade, and then you actually get blown up because it was actually a creeper behind you. So that's the only interesting, cool thing that could come out from that. But I do agree in general that it could get old fast. And let's say you're playing the game, like let's say that mob is introduced and you're playing the game for another 6 years. Like, would it start to just get annoying, or would it be like, how long can something be creepy for until it becomes just straight up annoying? That's something that is interesting to think about.
Yeah. So I guess the Shade and the Stalker were kind of a pair, sort of. Like there were two distinct mobs that would kind of work together.
Exactly, yeah. So the idea was that the shade was meant to kind of throw you off. So let's say you have something like the warden that is stalking around the ancient city, and then you have shades that specifically the idea was the shades would be quite prominent in the ancient city. Maybe they wouldn't even spawn anywhere else. And the idea was mechanically, how can we make the player trip up and make mistakes? And I think one way to do that is, okay, what if we have quite like provocative sounds that make you start running? For example, a hissing sound behind you, like, oh crap, I'm about to die, I'm about to get blown up. And then suddenly that's going to make you run and not sneak and trip up some sensors. Um, and so that was kind of that idea behind it being a companion mob. It's something that would make the player mess up. But if you're smart about it, if you remember, okay, I need to look around, I need to be very conscious of like what is real and what is not, hopefully the players would be able to overcome that.
Interesting. I wonder how hard it was to like make sure something was not too scary, but like still scary. And like especially how there's so many like different ideas and like of what things are, like how scary things should be, and like what fear is, and what scares each individual person and how much. Like I've got friends in real life that have just said they're not going to the deep dark because they're too scared of it, and then there are other people who are saying, oh, this is lame, let's make a new model for the warden, add all this sort of stuff. Like how do you actually figure out like what's the perfect balance, like, and how do you know you've struck that balance?
Yeah, I did think about this a lot. I think the most important thing to remember in general when it comes to horror is that the scariest thing is um it's the monster in the shadows. It's a thing that you can't see. It's where there is vagueness to your situation. And I think what makes the warden less scary over time is when you actually understand it and when you have, good vision of it. So you start to see it and you're like, okay, that's a warden, that's the way it looks, this is the way it behaves. And then kind of that mystery starts to dissolve and fade over time. And in a game like Minecraft, which is a sandbox, you can't really fix that. It's just inherent to the systems and the style of gameplay that is Minecraft, that you will start to become comfortable and knowledgeable of things throughout the world. So on that level, we're never going to be able to make something scary forever. It's just not possible. This is actually something that, proper AAA or whatever, like indie horror games struggle with now, even if it's just a linear story driven game. It's really difficult to make a monster that you've already seen still scary. And one of the games that one of the companies that I'm very passionate about is and the game and their games is Frictional Games. They make games like Amnesia and Soma and Penumbra. And one of the things that they have talked about in their blogs is like, um, it's quite important that once a monster has been shown, you either have two choices. You can't ever show it again after an encounter, or you need to like make it put it in a context that is so different that it basically feels like a different monster. Um, and so the fact that even a linear storytelling game has those problems of like, okay, we can't really like unveil the curtain. It feels like it's just kind of almost impossible in a game like Minecraft. So that's the first answer to your question, which is like scariness. I think we can never make it scary forever. In terms of striking the balance of like what is an acceptable scary, especially for a game like Minecraft, which is played by many, many kids in the game, or many people of all different ages and many different, experiences and backgrounds. Um, I don't know why, but I kind of looked a little bit to Pixar and their movies. And this is not in the context of horror, but instead in the context of humor. That a lot of Pixar movies, they have kind of on the surface what appears to be sort of maybe childish or a bit like naive, or I don't know how to describe it. It may appear on the surface to not have much depth to it. It's just kind of what is presented. But then as you grow older and you watch those same Pixar movies, you start to notice little subtle nuanced things that are like, oh, that particular comment or that piece of dialogue that was meant for adults. And then you get it and you might laugh or whatever, and you have kind of a different way of viewing that experience compared to when you watched it as a younger kid. And I think I kind of wanted to pull that inspiration from Pixar movies, but in the context of horror, which is that on the surface, the warden isn't meant to look particularly terrifying. It definitely plays up terrifying visuals. It's got like this rib cage, it's got kind of soul faces in it. It's got a beating heart. It's got this gaping mouth and all that. Like it can look scary, but also the fact that it is Minecraft and that it is kind of abstract and the visuals of it is abstract. It's literally just cubes and the pixelated textures. I think we kind of leaned in on purpose into this idea of like on the surface it doesn't necessarily look like absolutely terrifying compared to some proper horror games that have like the ability to make everything look gory and horrific and horrible. But beyond that surface, I wanted to add a bit of nuance to the horror experience. And that's where I drew in, this idea that the scariest thing is the thing that you can't see. This is why there is the darkness effect. There is this pulsating. And I think kind of relying a little bit more on the audio experience more so than the visual experience is what brings out the first time that you experience the Warden. It brings out a much more terrifying feeling for players because they don't know what's going on. They can't see what it actually looks like. Instead, they're faced with the unknowns and or kind of like, what if? What if it looks like this? Or what if it does this? Why can't I see it? Where is it? I can hear this beating heart in the background. Is that my own heart or is that the creature's heart? I don't know what's going on. Like all of that is so much more terrifying than actually physically seeing the Warden, like right in front of you. So it's a long answer, but I think that's kind of some of the ideas that I was thinking about while developing the Warden.
So you expect each player to kind of come up with something that, like in their imagination, that was kind of they could relate to and that they would find scary by themselves, and then another player would come up with something else that they might find scary in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. I think relying on their own experiences of what is scary and trying to probe that out of them is actually much more effective than trying to make a creature which looks scary. Because if you try to make a creature that looks scary, as you've rightly pointed out, it's only going to look scary to some people. So instead, if you just kind of scrap that idea and make the imagination run wild, I think that's just so much more effective.
Yeah, and also what you're saying about humor. I was thinking, how would you make a game that like is primarily focused on humor? And then I realized, no, they already exist. It's just that a lot of the humor comes from kind of the players. Like if you play, I think it's Jackbox, we have all those games. Most of the humor comes from what other people have made, like what they've drawn
Mm.
for a certain prompt or what they read a certain prompt as, and the way that it kind of evolves over time. Stuff like that. Like the humor ultimately comes from the players. It's not the game designers deliberately like putting something funny because like you laugh at something once, sure, you laugh at something again maybe later, but yeah, eventually it gets old. But if the players themselves are kind of supplying that, just how the players' imaginations are supplying the horror for them, then yeah, it can have a much greater longevity.
Yeah, definitely. I think to amend what you said, I'd say the best humor comes from other players. But I think there are other games, single player games even, that do try to do humor. Like I think one thing that comes to mind right now is like Stanley Parable. Although I guess that's more satire, which can be very funny. So I guess, that's humor. But it is interesting, like to think about games like Stanley Parable and then contrast them with games like Jackbox, where again, the funniest moments for me in gaming, I guess, would be things like Jackbox or even games like Town of Salem, if you've ever played that before. Those multiplayer games that bring out just these kind of absolutely unexpected situations you never expect. That is the funniest moments for me, much more than any scripted game could be.
Yeah, especially with multiplayer, because it's a lot easier to laugh if you're with other people.
Yeah, and you can bring your subjective experience to it, right? Like almost in a multiplayer game, especially if you know the players, like let's say you're all in Discord call together, you're almost acting as if you have an audience and you know all the players in the call, you know the humor, you know what they find funny. So because you have that subjective experience of like what your friend group is, you can provide what will be funny to that group. Whereas if you provided that same thing to another group, they might find it, I don't know, cringy or like just horrible or whatever, or just completely unfunny. But like that's kind of the point, right? If you curate the experience for players' subjective experiences or give them the tools to do that. I think it's just better for the game. Maybe that's why Minecraft is so good, because it just gives you tools and then you do what you think is fun.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the way that you've tried out different horror elements, like how I think one of the Sculk iterations was based on trypophobia, and the Hollowed had the fangs or maybe bandages, and that was deemed too gory as well. So, um, did you feel like it was worth exploring those concepts, even if, like, for the purposes of, if you wouldn't literally want to put something that triggers anyone's phobias or anything like that, like super bad? The same thing with epilepsy. Like, you wouldn't want to trigger someone having an epileptic fit, even if you wanted to create this specific experience. So, how did you go into adding that sort of almost gore, almost kind of phobia triggering stuff? Like, did you feel like it was what lessons did you learn from going down that path? Because presumably you wouldn't really be able to put them in the game if they were problematic in that way.
Yeah. I guess what I learned is that I'm really glad that we have an amazing art team, and an amazing game director as well, because I think my intuition when iterating on what became the Warden was I wanted to try and see how far can we push it and get away with it. And I like my gut feeling and like what I ended up doing, because like I actually did a few of the textures for the initial Warden. Like we'd get concept arts, and then from that concept art I would try to mock up textures. I'm not a great texture artist, but I tried it anyway. And I would just kind of pick out like the concepts that I thought were like the most interesting and kind of pushed Minecraft into like new spaces. And so I tried things like the trypophobia thing. And I think in general it was worth it to do, because it kind of it allowed us to set a line which we maybe weren't entirely aware of what the line was yet. Because we do have scary stuff in Minecraft before the water, definitely. Like I think the Enderman, when it was first introduced, was terrifying to me, and even just skeletons and zombies was terrifying. But finding out where that true line is was probably quite important for this whole process, and it will probably inform us on future designs in the game in the future. Um, but kind of the process was, I would try and push, and I would say, this feels like it would be really, really cool. And then the art team or the game director would come in and say, I don't know, I think this is probably too much for Minecraft. And then they dial it back. And then we'd, dial it back again. And we'd kind of just go back and forth to figure out where that line is. And then we finally came to the Warden. And I think, it is entirely possible for us to add probably something visually a little scarier than the Warden in the game. But for the Warden in particular, I think the result that we had is probably the perfect line to stop, because kind of talking about what I said with, the unknowns, the monster in the darkness, that sort of stuff. I think it was kind of better for the Warden to be more ambiguously frightening in its visuals rather than explicitly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you kind of reached the end of an iteration and then thought, okay, well this isn't working, like from the Stalker where you reckon the limbs rearranging was a bit too goofy. Like, how did you just kind of stop it and like almost start again from scratch, but with what you've learned from the previous one kept in mind, or did they kind of almost evolve eventually to the final product?
I think it depends on the iteration. So the Stalker was definitely, I think there was some aspects of it that got just completely carried over to, I think it was the Hollowed after that. Um, the whole sensing vibrations thing that was in the Stalker already. So that thing was just completely carried over to the next iteration. But there were some things that just, got completely scrapped or like reworked. Like the visuals of it, the rearranging, the different states of like, if it's like on the ground or if it's standing up tall, that sort of stuff would just get completely axed from the prototype, right? So there are some cases where like there were huge like divergences when it came to, for example, Stalker to Hollowed. But I think when we got to things like the Hollowed to eventually the Warden, that was much more subtle. That was actually an evolution, as you spoke of. Like the visuals changed, and then sort of the underlying mechanics changed. We kind of just slowly changed the code over time until it became what was the Warden in the 2020 Minecraft Live.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, because the only data I have on Warden Iterations is the Shade and the Stalker, and then a bunch of random ones. I think the ones I got from the video was a body made of scales, an albino owl, a skull mask, a white hunchback, and then the Hollowed. And I guess those kind of ones in the middle were just kind of part of that smooth iteration. That's why there isn't much detail about them. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Like there was a point in time after the Hollowed that like we just kind of kept throwing visuals at it. We would try it out in game through actual pixel art, and we'd get a feeling for like just what felt right. And at that point, I wouldn't say the mechanics too much changed. There were some times where the visuals of the mob influenced, like, oh, maybe it could do this. But once we got past the Hollowed, I would say we had a pretty good idea of, first of all, sort of the body stature, like the silhouette. Like it was kind of this big hulking beast. And we had an idea for, the general mechanics of the mob. And so I would say at that point, it was more just like once you got to all those things, like you said, like the albino owl, that was more about, okay, what different visuals are we trying to evoke from this creature?
I see. And there's quite a lot of Sculk iterations as well. The ones I have down is Rust, Bone, two types of corruption. Oh wait, there's even the third type of corruption, the one that's like hollow and rotten on the inside. And it's quite cool how the Warden iterations and the Sculk iterations kind of came together to form this Sculk family.
Yeah, yeah. From the very beginning, I always looked at the Skulk and the Warden as kind of related in some way, whether uh, like materially or whatever. In any sort of way, we kind of imagine them as a related set of features visually. Um, and I remember the first iteration we actually came upon was the Rust, because I was thinking in general of like what could be like what would a sort of like corruption-esque block look like in Minecraft? And we were trying to experiment with like different ideas of like, okay, what is the corruption? What causes the corruption? And one idea we came up with, which was the first one, was the rust, and it was like, okay, instead of it just being this generic thing of like slowly creating kind of like a void or like darkness or whatever, what if it could be actually the blocks, the fundamental aspects of the block actually rust into this like entirely new material, and it kind of makes everything sort of like homogeneous, like everything turns into rust over time. And we were kind of going with that idea with like a visual iteration of the Warden as well at the time, and I think that was really cool. But like we iterated through quite a lot of different visuals. Like there was I think you mentioned like the hollowed iteration, that was kind of thinking about what if like the corruption is sort of slowly over time it's turning the block into essentially nothing. Like it has like this fleshy, like this white flesh around it, but like the holes are expanding and beneath it is actually just complete void. And that is what you could see on the hollowed iteration itself. Like the idea is that slowly over time it's actually spreading this void throughout the world. So yeah, we did try many different like underlying concepts of what the sculk was, but I think what we came to in the end was actually much more interesting. And instead of it being like an actual corruption, um, it's well, I mean, I can't get into like the actual details of what sculk is because quasi law needs to theorize, right? But I think the ideas are much more interesting and a little less vague with Skulk. And I think that's what's really cool. And it's not something that just spreads forever, right? Like it has a cause and effect. And I think that's much more interesting than the original version. And actually, I can even talk about like the Skulk catalyst in the first version. It actually just spread over time. And it would have like a max reach. It had nothing to do with XP or like mobs dying or anything. It just slowly spread. And I think, you see this in a lot of games, this idea of like a corruption slowly spreading. But I think what we arrived on with the Sculk is just so much more interesting. I love the cause and effect of Sculk and what it implies for the game's world.
Yeah, definitely. Like if it did spread by itself, then you might like find some deep dark under your base and it's just like covered with skulk, and then you like go like 1,000 blocks across and like go caving, and then you just find with one with barely any. It feels like it would kind of feel weird. So it's cool that there's a kind of in universe kind of cause and effect there.
Yeah. And not to like geek out too much about my own features, but I really love with the Skulk that, you know, the gameplay mechanics inform the world itself. Like when let's say you're a new player and you go into the ancient city or the deep dark and you see all this Skulk around, you're like, wow, this is really creepy. This is really kind of disgusting. Like, what is this? It kind of sounds fleshy. And like when I mine it up with a hoe, it sounds like it's screaming, that sort of stuff. And then you kill something, maybe accidentally next to the Skull catalyst, and then you notice it spread, and you're like, oh shit. Like, that's what it is. That's what Skulk is. Like, that to me is so cool that the the mechanics of the game itself inform you of how this world was formed. And I think that's so cool to me.
Yeah, I mean, nothing wrong with geeking out about your own features. That's why you're on here after all.
Yeah.
Some other things that I wanted to clear up. About cheesing. I remember there was this tweet that used to be talked about a lot by you. Where someone said, "Oh, well, how would the warden prevent cheesing? Would it like kind of hit us? Would it have a ranged attack?" And you mentioned something more mind altering. I'm wondering if you're allowed to expand on that because there was a source of a lot of speculation there.
Yeah, I probably teased that up too much. I mean, I can reveal a bit about it. So at the time, we were wondering, again, how can we prevent cheesing the warden? And one of the things in particular was like, let's say you build up sort of like a wall in between you and the warden, and maybe you actually wall up all around you. It can literally not punch you at all. Um, and so I actually remember talking at the time to Jens. This might have been actually in 2020 at Minecraft Live. And, we were exploring ideas of things like ranged attacks. And I kind of explained that, the biggest problem with any sort of ranged attack is that it's not going to be able to like pass walls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in the end, we actually did have a ranged attack that passed through walls. But I remember that we got into a conversation about like block breaking and like, oh, we feel like, block breaking is probably not really something that we want to do. Like it's something which until we have the right technology, if and even if we do have the right technology, it kind of feels like something that should be for the player themselves. Like they're kind of the ultimate champion of being able to modify the world around them. And of course, we have things like creepers, but I think the fact that they're isolated to creepers is actually what makes creepers special. And if you start bringing that to more mobs, then suddenly the identity of the creeper is kind of lost, or at least it gets like diluted. Um, and so I was quite adamant that I don't want the warden to break any blocks because I felt like that was a bit cheap. There were ideas of like, oh, what if I only broke a deep slate? But like, that's not really interesting. And even if it was deep slate, what's preventing you from placing, I don't know, wool or some other block that you have in your inventory in order to prevent it from attacking you?
What about burrowing through walls? Would that kind of have similar problems to breaking blocks, as like it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what they should burrow through?
Um, yeah, so I think there were ideas for me, of like what if the warden could burrow and like sort of move around through the like terrain itself. I mean, again, the problem is always, yeah, you can build up a tower, then you can just detach a block underneath, and that way it can never get to you. Um, it is possible, but there were problems like that. And then the other problem is that it is really difficult to code, and we had a limited time in order to release the wild update. So we had to be very conscious of like how we solved the cheesing problem without um, just not solving it all, because if we chose something very complicated, maybe we wouldn't even be able to get that aspect of the feature in, and then more players would be disappointed. So we had to be quite conscious of what solution we were bringing to the table. So again, I think borrowing is really cool, and I think like it'd be interesting to revisit the Warden at some point and maybe introduce something like that. But I don't think it should have been the core solution to that problem with the time that we had.
Yeah, that's fair enough. It's something like Sonic Boom. It's just like, oh, people using shields. Okay, now it goes through shields. Oh, people are trying to wall things off. Okay, now it goes through blocks. You know.
Exactly. So there was all that discussion, and one idea that I think like I was like iterating on with Jens is like, okay, what if it had some ability to sort of like enter your mind from afar? If like let's say maybe if it's in the area and it is not able to attack you yet, but you've kind of been around that like darkness causing effect for a long time, maybe it would start to like penetrate your mind, and it could either like make you start like moving around like really erratically, like maybe when you press like forward you press back, and it would start to slowly deal damage to you over time. So basically the idea is that if you hit from the warden and it was actually pursuing you and it couldn't attack you, it would slowly over time kind of take over your mind and then just kill you. That was the idea. But we ended up going with something a little more basic, which is just the ranged attack, which I'm not entirely. I wouldn't say I'm like 100% happy with, but I think it serves its job well, and it's probably the least complicated solution that we could have come up with, which is probably better in the end. Like the more complicated the warden becomes, the more difficult it is to communicate to the player what is actually happening. And I don't really know how we would convey to the player that the warden is entering your mind. Like you could have some sort of overlay, but like that gets complicated.
Yeah, also taking control away from the player like that is it's kind of questionable as well. Because like even if you only move erratically when you're actually trying to move, like it reminds me of similar example. I was thinking about how an anglerfish would work in Minecraft, the ones with little lights that attract fish and then eat them.
Mm.
And some suggestions I'd seen in the past have it like if you look at the light, you start to just be drawn towards it, and I feel like that didn't really kind of convey the sense of like actually yourself being attracted to it. Whereas if it was, for example, like had a massive XP orb on it, and you could only see the XP orb, and for some reason you thought that massive XP orbs could spawn in the ocean, then you'd
Yeah.
actually be drawn to it, and you'd actually fall for it instead of just be like, oh no, I looked at that thing. Now I guess I'm gonna be inexplicably drawn towards it and have no way to fight that or whatever. So yeah, mind altering is a really difficult thing to do. It seems like, but that is so cool that I got to find out what it was finally because I was so curious about that for so long.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not anything like too complicated. And I think, it was just kind of ideas. So we were throwing around ideas, and I think I prototyped it for a little bit. And, it never really got anywhere because in the end, we had to refocus on other things. And uh, I was still worried later on about the cheesing. So that's when we created the range attack. But bringing up the anglerfish example, I think that's really interesting because that's basically what the stalker did. Like, that was the idea of like, but in your case, with like the giant XP or what would make it perfect, and what like the stalker actually did is maybe there are actually big XP orbs in the deep ocean for whatever reason, and you can actually go to them sometimes, and they are actually there, and you can actually gain like a huge amount of XP from it. But then sometimes it's not the real big XP orb, and then you go up to it and it's like, oh crap, it's an anglerfish. So I think I agree with you. I much rather the idea of like genuinely deceiving the player based on prior knowledge that they have that there are big XP orbs.
Yeah, that's right. Because the stalker had the crystals, and there would be genuine crystals around the area. But if you grab the crystal in the stalker, it would wake up, right?
Exactly, yes.
I found it quite interesting when I was playing in the Deep Dark because a lot of kind of the ancient cities kind of overtook I think the regular Deep Dark biome when they were revealed and people were playtesting. Like when people were playtesting
Mhm.
stuff, they'd always just like go to the ancient cities, and of course it has wall there, and it's like very specifically designed. And but like going to the regular Deep Dark, like you don't have wall there unless you brought it with you, and there's a bunch of other stuff that just makes it completely different. Like especially if you're in a cramped cave. Like I've had a couple times where I've been in like a spaghetti cave or maybe a traditional cave carpet. I'm not sure. Point is, it was very crammed, and there was a warden coming after me, and there was loops everywhere, and I'm like, oh my goodness, how am I going to get out of the situation? And I just had to get away as far away as I could and wall it off so that it wouldn't like figure out to use its sonic boom. But it would still know I'm
Yeah.
nearby, so it wouldn't despawn. So I was just kind of sitting there in the end of a cave, walled off, thinking, what am I going to do? And anyway, my main what I'm actually trying to ask is like with shriekers, did you prototype them being like deliberately put in places as a kind of developer design puzzle? Like, oh, you've got one shrieker over here, one shrieker over here. Where do you place the wool or another block, or which one do you mine first in order to avoid triggering the warden? There was one time, sorry, this question is getting quite long, but there was one time where I found a Sculk Shrieker on top of one of those little towers, and
Yeah.
I thought it was Mosh. I thought Mosh had specifically put that there, and I was like, Mosh, oh my goodness, trust you to do it. I look at the next one over, it doesn't have it. I'm like, okay, that was random. But like, did you ever think about like deliberately doing stuff like that as kind of puzzles for the player to work out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, with the cramped cave example, like one conscious decision that we made was to have the spawn rate of Skulk Shriekers very, very low if it wasn't in an ancient city. So if it was just in a generic deep dark biome, that would kind of be like your, let's say it led up to an ancient city later on, that would be like your sort of lead up onboarding experience of like, okay, this is what a skulk sensor is, and oh, sometimes, like very rarely, I'll find a skulk shrieker, and then maybe I'll kind of figure out the experience of like, okay, there's three levels of darkness, and then eventually you get to the warden spawning. Um, but I think, as you kind of pointed out, sometimes the geometry of the caves don't really make that like an excellent experience, and I think that's just kind of the unfortunate but also fortunate aspect of Minecraft, in that it is procedurally generated and every experience is different. And sometimes that could be a good thing and sometimes that could be a bad thing. It just kind of depends on the experience. When it came to the ancient cities themselves, maybe this is a disappointing answer, but like I don't think I 100% thought through like my reason. Well, it's not that I didn't think through my reasoning, it's more that it didn't really occur to me at any point that I wanted the Skulk Shriekers to be like deliberately designed and placed in certain areas. And I think the reason for that is my just gut feeling assumption was that the experience would always be better if it was procedural, if there was random locations that the Skulk Shriekers could spawn. Now, in saying that, there is some element of design to it, because in the structure files itself we have a I believe it's like a jigsaw piece, and with that jigsaw piece we can say we want a skulk patch to generate here with a higher rate of skulk shrieker spawning. And so, as a result of that, in certain structures, we can say, okay, we want a patch here which has a lot of Sculk Shriekers, or a higher chance for it, which means that some structures will have generally more Sculk Shriekers than others. Just as one example, all the walls that you have in the ancient city, they don't really have any of those patches generated, and as a result of that, you kind of generally have like a safe space when you're on the walls, especially it has carpet and wool in the inside, which means that it's kind of your safe zone. You go to the walls and you can traverse the biome without being too worried about Skulk Shriekers activating. But then as soon as you get outside of the walls and you go into a structure, that's when you have to be a little bit worried. So there's definitely like some element of placing things, but it's the random procedural element is still very much present. And yeah, I guess just in my mind that was always the obvious answer, because in your case, like the example you brought up, like it's much more exciting when you don't know where a Sculk Shrieker is going to be. It means that each structure in each ancient city you go to is a different like procedural puzzle for you to diffuse.
Yeah, yeah, it allows for a lot more variation. Also, I remembered what the third thing was that you kind of rolled in: snowballs. Snowballs barely used for
Mm.
anything except pretend snowball fights and things like that. But then since they're a projectile that don't make much noise when you throw it and are pretty easy to carry around, that's another thing.
Oh yeah, in terms of like bringing more relevance to older features, yeah, definitely. I think like it's interesting that I gravitated towards snowballs because any projectile could work. You could easily use eggs. You could easily use even just arrows themselves, like shooting an arrow with your bow. But I think it was more for me like the fantasy of the world building itself, and that's why eventually we added the icebox structure. They're just like, okay, what if there were snowballs in the city that could kind of suggest and hint to the player, hey, you can distract this warden if you want. Like you're able to kind of divert it into certain areas. I remember at a certain point I was wondering, oh, could we add like a rock item? Maybe there's like rocks on the floor and you could like break it to pick it up and then you could throw it. But that also just kind of felt like, again, what's the point of adding a whole new item, like a whole new decoration item, just for this one particular purpose when we can reutilize older legacy features in order to convey the same mechanic? So I guess that's why I gravitated towards a snowball. It's probably also because snowballs are just not really used for much other than this like snowball fights, right?
Right. I think that's pretty much all I had to talk about. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of like any kind of secrets of development? Not like secrets, but any sort of fun facts from development that you'd like people to that you'd like to talk a bit more about regarding the Warden and just kind of its whole place in the game?
Well, I guess the only thing that I would say, which I might have brought this up a few times for some people, but I'm really happy with the Warden in the end. There are some aspects of it that I still think need some tweaking. Like right now, I think it's entirely possible to just create like a redstone clock, and it will forever just be attracted to that redstone clock, and literally because of the the cooldown between vibrations, your footsteps will never alert it. So there's stuff like that that still needs to be iterated on. But I think the success for me of the Warden is the fact that we had so much time to really iterate on it over and over again. And I'm quite confident if we had just stopped at the first version of the Stalker, even though it had some really cool ideas, if we just did that, I don't think it would have been as compelling of a feature as it ended up being. And so I guess my general takeaways from that is just that, taking your time to iterate and taking your time to explore these concepts is really important for the game. And maybe that can be, an explanation for some people in the community of what tends to take time. Generally, with developing features in Minecraft, of course, there's always aspects like sometimes the engine can be difficult to work with, and that is certainly an aspect. But I think from the design perspective, there is also that element of thinking about, does this really fit in Minecraft, and how can we iterate on this until we arrive at something that truly fits the game and elevates other features that already exist in the game. And I think the Warden was a pretty good success story for that.
Yeah, iteration is tremendously important. Like, yeah, when you see a lot of people saying, "Oh, why did this take so long?" and they don't know about all the work that just kind of, even things that were explored, and then they just decide not to do them, but kind of learn from it. Um, it's really cool that we get to see the path that comes up to that with all the details about the shade, the stalker, and the hollowed, and everything in between. It's just cool to see that there's all that stuff being done behind the scenes that we still get to have a look at. And the Warden is like a prime example of, like, things take time. Look at how many iterations this went through. Look at all the things that they had to think about, like to add something like that changes kind of Minecraft's like horror DNA almost. And like how
Mm.
hard it is to get that right, and how much effort needs to be put in, and the fact that also Mojang thought it was a worthy thing to include just shows how much you believe in this feature, that you're willing to iterate through it so much and get it like so polished, and explore the entire, well, I mean not the entire, but like explore the design space and make sure that you find something that you can be absolutely proud of and say, yes, we figured things out, and we explore these things, and this is what we came to, and this is what we're putting in the game. There are a whole lot of other stuff, but this is what we've got.
I think for me, like another example of that is just the ancient cities themselves. Like we had sort of vague ideas of including structures throughout the Deep Dark, but it turned out to be something that I could never imagine. And of course, it has like wider implications of the entire, I guess Minecraft world itself, sort of the seeds that have been planted throughout it, including things like echo shards and like what the warden is and where did these structures come from, and what is all of it, and that mystery is something that isn't just created in one iteration. It's something that it evolves and builds over time. So yeah, I think again, very very happy with it, and I think it is better than it was when we showed it off at 2020 Minecraft Live.
Oh man, I can't even imagine like immediately entering the deep dark biome and finding a warden straight away, and being like, oh god, I guess I can't go this way.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a good experience for sure.
Yeah. Oh, there was one little thing. The Ender Dragon death was supposed to have a special Sculk catalyst interaction. Are you can you say what it was, or is it kind of scrapped and like trying to be forgotten about?
So the special interaction was basically, instead of it actually dropping all of that, so there were multiple different ideas. So one idea was, instead of it uh dropping all of that XP would just not drop, and instead all of the XP would kind of be funneled into the Skull Catalyst just by default, and then it would start spreading like a lot, basically taking over the entire island. But another idea was also, what if when the XP orbs land on the ground next to a Skull Catalyst, they create a charge, so it automatically consumes that XP and converts it into a charge. I think this is something that we still want to do, but we just need to find the time for it. So it's not like a scrapped interaction. It's more just like, okay, when do we have the right time in our schedule to be able to deliver like that small little polish? I think that's the sad thing sometimes about updates, and of course the schedules and the deadlines that we have, is that those small little interactions, they kind of get pushed to the wayside, unfortunately. But it's just the reality of having updates every year. We need to find ways to be able to deliver the features that we have planned, and on the side we can of course try our best to reintegrate them into some of the updates.
Yeah, especially when you consider how many players like haven't even visited the end, let alone killed the dragon.
Yeah, no, exactly. So there's always like a priority to certain things, right? Like there are so little players who do go to the end. So is that interaction more important than, let's say, the sonic boom for the warden? And that's something that you have to bring into context and perspective when you prioritize certain features.
Mm. Something that I find personal about the warden is it's quite common to it's quite similar to a monster that used to give me a lot of nightmares. It's called the Glass from the Del Toro Quest book series. I think it's an Australian author, so you might know it. But yeah, it's kind of similar because the maze also contained an amethyst, and amethysts are like all over ancient cities as well. So the glass and the warden seem really similar to me, and I find that so cool because it's like something that gave me a lot of nightmares, and I'm a lot older, and it's a humanoid, but like very very similar experience that I got, and it makes it feel a lot more personal to me, especially how like the glass, I don't think it can even see. It primarily uses like vibration and smell, so it's just like a remarkable coincidence.
So sorry, is this Gloss from Del Toro Quest? Is that what
Yeah,
you said?
it's from book 6, The Maze of the Beast.
Okay, yeah, I'm just looking at it now. It's really creepy. Oh my god. Oh, this is awesome.
I know.
Yeah, it's kind of like a slime creature. Like, and it even has like these little sort of tendrils at the top
Exactly.
as well. Oh wow. Wow. Yeah, no, so I'm looking at the wiki and it says like its hearing and sight are quite weak. Although that I guess is the difference between the warden. But no, that's cool. Like, and this is kind of, I mean, of course, there are some visual similarities here, like the tendrils and stuff. But this is what I was talking about with like kind of delving deeper into your own subjective experiences to provide that horror. So like, if you feel any of those connections, and the warden is vague enough that you can apply your own experiences on top of it as like a layer of horror, like that's great. That's exactly what I intended. Yeah, it's good to hear. I hope it scares the shit out of you.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was playtesting the Warden on stream and everything, and I was doing it at night and everything with the lights off. I had a small little light to illuminate my face because I was using face cam as well. And for some reason, when I went into it, I was just being super calm and methodical. For some reason, when I get kind of scared in that way, I just kind of tend to let my rational side of my brain take over and just kind of do everything for me. It was a really fun experience.
It's interesting. It's like a almost like a defense mechanism,
Yeah.
but a good one actually. Like that's actually quite useful for me. I'm just ugh. It's funny. As much as I love horror games, like whenever I played, for example, Amnesia or Soma, like I'm horrible with horror games. I literally jump at literally anything, like just the smallest tiny sound. I start like shaking at everything. Like I'm that bad with it. So it's really interesting that I'm so fascinated with horror and love it so much, even though like objectively or subjectively, I just do not like playing horror games. It's the worst experience ever. But I'm so fascinated with them. That's what I love about designing horror. Like it's just such a fascinating design space.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely shown that with the warden and all the effort that's gone into it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Is there anything you wanted to plug?
Yeah, sure. I guess you can find me on Twitter at Kingbdogz. The Kingbdogz is with a Z at the end. Other than that, not really anything. Like I don't use. I've got Instagram, but I don't use it. I've got Reddit, but like there's no point following my profile. So yeah, just go to Kingbdogz on Twitter.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's us. Really happy we managed to do this. There's been so many questions that I've had, and it's been great to have them all answered. So thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, let us know by leaving a like or become a YouTube member like Yal, Elethris, Salor7, and Stonepaint Man have. I've got plenty more exciting videos planned, so subscribe and hit the bell, and soon they should be up for you to enjoy. See you next time!